Hi, I'm Mark, and in this video we are going to have a look at the new responsive engine in Bubble. In fact, this is the first video in a series I'm doing about this new responsive engine, and we will start with the very foundation of the new responsive engine. So we will cover the theory behind it, and then we will start building basic layouts. And in the next videos, we are going to extend those layouts in order to rebuild a professional, responsive, and nicely looking website. So I hope that sounds good to you. Let's have a look at the basics of the new responsive engine. This new responsive engine is based on the so-called flexbox concept, which comes from CSS, but don't worry, we won't write any CSS, at least not in this video. And as you will see, it's important to understand at least the basics of the flexbox concept in order to get a grasp on how the new responsive engine actually works. So let's dive right in. Flexbox is all about how elements are positioned inside of a containing element. So here you can see we have a container element, and this container element has child elements inside of it. So if no flexbox layout is applied, at least in Bubble, we can place these elements freely inside of the canvas. But as soon as we apply a flexbox layout, which can either be a row layout or a column layout, things are going to change, because if we apply a flexbox layout to a surrounding container, we make the container into a flex container, and the children inside of that container will become flex items. Here we determine the layout of the flex container to be a row layout, and this means that the main axis inside of that container is going to be horizontal, and basically all the items, all the direct children inside of the flex container are aligned along the main axis. You of course won't see the main axis, this is just a virtual concept, but in fact, knowing that there is a main axis helps in understanding the flexbox layouts and also in understanding the new responsive engine, because it works in the very same way. So again, here we say the flex container should contain a row layout. So in a row layout, we have a main axis that is horizontal, and all the elements are aligned along the horizontal axis. There's a column gap between the items. Can be there, it doesn't have to be there, but you can use Bubble to set this column gap. You will see later on how this works. You can determine the flex container to be a column 2. If the layout inside of the flex container is a column, then the main axis will not be horizontal, but it will be vertical. And again, the flex items will always align along the main axis. But in that case, in the case of column, they would be stacked on top of each other because the main axis is a vertical one. So there is another axis involved, which is the cross axis. And if the container layout is a column layout, then the main axis is vertical, but the cross axis is horizontal. You can use the cross axis too to position your elements. So for example, it's perfectly fine to say that the element in the middle should be centered along the cross axis, and the third element here should be, well, aligned to the right hand side along the cross axis, but still these elements, these flex items, are stacked on top of each other concerning the main axis. What's also possible is to define how wide these elements are. So it's easy to say that the elements should stretch from one end of the cross axis to the other. Everything that I've just shown you also works with a row. So in that case, if I have a row layout applied to my flex container, the main axis is horizontal. So the flex items, as they always align along the main axis, they are placed next to each other. But again, I have this cross axis. This time the cross axis is vertical because the main axis is horizontal. And here it's also possible to align the flex items not only along the main axis, but also along the cross axis, just like that. And also, in that case, I can define that the flex items stretch along the cross axis. And well, Well, that's it. That's a little crash course on the basics of the flexbox concept. And although the new responsive engine in Bubble is not an exact copy of the flexbox concept, the main elements that you've just learned about will also apply to the new responsive engine, and I hope you will find that understanding the basics of flexbox will also help you to understand the new responsive engine and will help you get a grasp on it. So that's it for the theory. I hope that was easy to follow, because right now we are going to fire our bubble and apply this knowledge. And we will do that by adding a brand new page. I will call mine flexbox-tutorial. There it is. First thing, I'm going to open up the settings of the page, selecting Layouts tab, and here you can already find the most important setting in this tutorial, which is called the container layout. So container layout is a setting that you will find in the container elements in Bubble. And by modifying the layout, you can determine how the elements that are positioned inside of a container, so the direct children, are positioned. By default, the container layout is set to fixed, which means that you can pretty much place elements wherever you like, but there are more options. So align to parent is another option that we will probably not use, at least not in this tutorial. Row and column, meanwhile, are more important, because both row and column will turn the container that you've just selected into a flex container. And well, accordingly, row will make all items inside of the container align in a row, whereas column will make all items inside of a container align in a column. But for now, we will stick with fixed, because I want to show you some things here. First, we have a fixed width of 1080 pixels. This is by default. We will leave it at that for now. And we are going to add some elements to the canvas here and accordingly name them. So grp_container1 is the first group that I've added. The second group is grp_container2. And there's grp_container3. So right now it's white on white. I cannot distinguish anything. I need to find a nice looking color scheme. And the go-to site for finding color schemes, for me at least, is coolest.co. So let's see if we can find a few shades of blue here. And this one looks nice. So I'm going to copy the lightest shade and I'm going to assign it as the background of my page element. So simply by pasting it here, then I can copy another color, maybe the one in the middle here looks good. Got a copy and assign it to the first group. So in order to do that, I need to delete the default styling and then I need to select flat color as the background style. Then I can simply paste the hex value. And well, a nice little trick here is decreasing the opacity of the color, because when you do that and when you place elements on top of each other or inside of each other, it becomes easily visible where these elements intersect. You will see that in a second or two. I will save this style here. So I'm going to create a new style, call it custom group, and custom group will then basically apply the styling of the group that I've just selected to other groups. So I'm gonna create this here, and then I'm selecting the second group, and I'm not deleting the default styling, but I'm just reassigning a default styling here, custom group. And when I place the groups on top of each other, you can see what I meant before. Where they intersect, the color will be a little bit darker. And it's going to be even darker when 3 different groups intersect. Right? All right. So let's have a look at the preview tab here, how this behaves. And you can see pretty early on that the width of the page here, if I resize the browser window, you can see it easily. The width of the page here is fixed. As we've seen before, it's set to 1080 pixels. And this means it will not grow with the viewport or the browser window, and it also won't shrink with the viewport or the browser window. So at the bottom here, you can see that the scroll bar appears, which means basically that things are being cut off. So this certainly is not responsive. This is a pretty fixed layout. Before we continue here, I would like to show you a little, well, bug or feature in Bubble. And this is the following. So I usually like to work in the elements tree section, but sometimes I only find one root element appearing here, namely the page. And well, this certainly is a bug because, well, you should be able to see other elements, right? So there's a little workaround here. I can simply select one element on the page and click on reveal an elements tree, and everything will be visible again. So I'm selecting the page element, and I'm going from a fixed layout of the page element to a column layout. And as we've learned, both row and column will turn the surrounding container, the selected container, into a flex container, and will force the children to align accordingly. So if I select the column layout, all the children will align along the vertical axis. So basically they will be stacked on top of each other. Just like that. So right now there's no spacing between these elements. This means we can apply some gap spacing here. This is just one of the things that has changed here in this pop-up, because if you remember previously, we only were able to, for example, determine the width and the height of this container. But now, as we switch the layout to column, we have a little bit, well, more settings to choose from. For example, we can set a gap spacing, we can determine a minimum width, minimum height, we can determine the width for the UI builder, which basically doesn't restrict the page from growing or shrinking. It just determines how it's displayed here. So you will see the difference in a minute or two. So for now, we are going to apply some gap spacing and make it 15 pixels. So here's the gap. And if we now have a look at the preview pane, we can see that, well, the page stretches from one end of the viewport to the other, and it grows and shrinks with the viewport width. We can double check that with the responsive tab here. So by resizing the window here, you can see at this position how wide the page actually is. And as you can see here, the page, it starts growing and shrinking with the viewport width. So next thing we are going to do is we're going to try out what happens if we make the container layout of the page a row layout instead of a column layout. And well, pretty much what you'd expect, I guess, maybe except for one exception here, because right now the different groups that I have on the page, GRP container 1 and 2 and 3, are aligned next to each other. But we have a line break here, and this has to do with the fact that we have set a minimum width for each of those groups. The minimum width was 400, and of course if we get 3 times 400, that's 1200 pixels, and this means all of the groups do not fit in a row if we have a width of 1080 pixels in the UI builder. So let's add some column gap here in order to be able to distinguish these groups. And then we can switch to the responsive tab and finally increase our viewport width here. So if we go above 1230 pixels, 30 pixels because we've got this column gap here twice, then all of the boxes fit in one row. But if we go smaller, right, if we go smaller than 1230 pixels, then we got this line break. And this happens automatically. Nothing is being cut off. This happens automatically because we have determined the container layout of the page to be a row layout. So responsiveness basically comes out of the box, and we can even go smaller and still stay responsive, right? So this is pretty amazing in my opinion. One thing that does not seem right now is the fact that we have a pretty large row spacing here, a pretty large row gap. But this has to do with the fact that we have a minimum height applied to the page. So if we remove the minimum height, you can see that everything looks nice and tidy right now, even if we resize the viewport. So let's select the page and go back to the column layout again. So let's get back to the responsive tab, and well, one thing seems a little off because the three groups, they stick to the left hand side, and as we've learned before, we cannot only align along the main axis. So in that case, since the page layout is a column layout, the main axis is the vertical one, but we can also always align along the cross axis. So in that case, for example, we could center this first group along the cross axis, so we could center it horizontally. And this works by selecting the group itself, and here we can change the horizontal alignment, right? We need to modify the horizontal alignment of the group itself. We can do the same with the second and third group, and even if you resize the viewport now, you can see that each of the group stays at its position. So now I think we are all set to have a first look at the page that we are going to rebuild, and it's the website of a tool that you certainly are familiar with. This tool is called Discord Nitro. So Nitro is basically the premium version of Discord, and this is the page that we are focusing on, that we are going to rebuild in Bubble. And this page is nice and responsive. It has all the features that we are looking for. So if, for example, we go bigger, we have these two rows of perks here, and if we go smaller, then the cards, they shrink, and then there's also line break if you go too small, and we can even go a little bit smaller, and then we have these, well, lines of one card each. So that's what we are trying to rebuild. We won't focus the heading of the page or the footer, but we will focus on the first section here, the second section, the cards, the perks, and then the third section, the call to action with the two buttons. This is what we are going to be rebuilding in Bubble, and it will, well, look great. So I've created my own graphics here. I won't use the original ones. I will use mine because, well, they are mine. And well, right now we still got a fixed layout for the groups that we have on our canvas, and apparently we do not need these groups to be fixed because eventually these groups will represent the different sections of our page. So as we've seen, we got 3 sections on the original page, and we are going to replicate this. So we are going to have 3 sections, and each of these sections, well, shouldn't be limited to 400 pixels. So we will change the container layout of these sections. In order to do that, we will change the container layout of the first section of the first group to column. And as you can see, this changed the settings, the options that we have available for this group. And we are going to remove the fixed width setting, which makes the group stretch from one end of the page to the other. We will remove the minimum width, and this will allow the group to shrink as much as we want it to shrink. And we are going to do the same with the second group, but this time, well, we are still making it a flexbox container, but this time we are applying the row layouts, and this has to do with the cards that we are going to add to this later on. So here we will pick row and do the very same. We're going to remove the minimum width, and Here with the third group, same. All right, so these groups, they now can grow with the page, with the surrounding page, because the maximum width hasn't been set. It's basically set to infinity, and we got the minimum width of 0, so these groups can shrink as much as we need them to. So back to the UI builder. Something that I do not like about this setup is the fact that these groups, well, basically go from one end of the page to the other. They do not have any padding applied, and in order to apply some padding, we're going to do a little trick by adding another group, and this group will serve as a page wrapper. We'll put it at the top, and then we are going to add our existing groups inside of that page wrapper group here. I usually work with the elements tree because it's a little easier. So let's get the order right. And here you can see that the page wrapper turned this very dark shade of blue, and this has to do with the fact that basically all the groups that we have just added to this wrapper are placed on top of each other. This means we need to modify the layout of the page wrapper, because actually we want to achieve the same layout as we had before, like this column layout where the different groups are stacked on top of each other, but with a little spacing at the sides. So we need to style the page wrapper pretty much the same way as we styled the page. So we need to apply a column layout, apply some gap spacing, 15 pixels of gap spacing, and also we can apply the custom group styling to this page wrapper so that it's easier recognizable where the page wrapper starts and where it ends. So right now, apparently there is a minimum width applied to the page wrapper. So we go back to layout, and we are going to remove this limitation of 400 pixels. So the page wrapper can grow now all the way, right? So it grows and shrinks with the viewport width. And one thing that we are going to do is we are going to apply a minimum width of 0 to the page wrapper and a maximum width of 1000 pixels. And well, this simply is a styling choice. If the website is displayed on very large screens, we do not want to have a maximum width of, let's say, 3000 pixels or so, because our layout will be a little messed up. We're going to optimize our layout for 1000 pixels. And this 1000 pixels will be placed right in the center of the screen. So even if the screen goes very large, we still have our layout in the middle of the screen, neat and tidy. So this will be 1000 pixels. And if we go bigger with the viewport, now we can see this wrapper keeps growing with the viewport, but it stops when it's about, well, or exactly 1000 pixels in size. So now let's simply center this wrapper here, so it's in the middle of the page. And also let's rename the groups here. As I've mentioned before, these groups will represent the different sections of the original page. So the first one will contain the header section, and there we can remove the fixed width, just like we did before. So when we pulled these groups inside of the page wrapper group, then for some reason the settings got lost, so we need to reapply them. So this is basically just the same as we did before. Remove the minimum width, rename this group to GRP perks, and also remove the minimum width here. And this is the call to action group. So let's look at the preview. And if we increase the viewport width, we can see that the page suddenly stops growing, because as we've seen, the page is 1000 pixels wide max. But also the page keeps shrinking, or the wrapper keeps shrinking, because we have defined the minimum width of the wrapper to be 0 pixels. So nothing is being cut off, everything is adapting responsively. And well, this is pretty nice. Well, that's it for today, that's it for this video. Of course, we are far from being done, but I think we've covered a lot of ground already. We've learned about the basics of flexbox, which is the concept behind the whole new responsive engine, and then we've applied this flexbox by building a basic layout in Bubble. In the next video, we are going to fill this basic layout with content, so if you liked what you saw, please leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, it would mean the world to me. Thank you and bye bye.